This video is designed to help you understand the logic of the STEPS model and also to be comfortable with the process of how to use it. To start with, in terms of the logic, the STEPS model relates to a process of education that's transformational in nature. So if it's connected to the process of developing a reasonable adventurer, which you typically would be, then there's an assumption that we need you to get inside your inner world to be able to develop that conviction. Getting inside your inner world, of course, means that you're going to need to be able to develop that capacity for reflection. Because the ultimate outcome we're trying to achieve here is a capacity for self-negotiated action, which in this case is defined as the agency individuals demonstrate in directing their conscious thinking and action towards an adjustment of their inner and outer worlds in order to succeed in life, which is what we very much would like for you. It's about developing what we call ceilings, which are produced by conversion of an awareness of feelings into an understanding of feelings, into a greater sense of identity, and ultimately self-love. And that's what this process of steps is really ultimately designed to do, which is to enable you to transcend your surface thinking and feelings and bring it down to a much deeper level where you're in control and you can make adjustments between your inner and outer worlds. One of the big challenges that most people face is that this requires you to take a bit of a leap of faith. It requires you to trust the process, to believe that you can get from one side to the other. In doing that, I'm asking you to use exploration, to use the why, which we'll get to shortly, in a vertical way, and not to use it to justify, to continue, to explain, to clarify the previous statement that you've made. So it's very important that you understand this, because you can follow the process in one sense and still not use the process. There's two separate things happening. There's the steps themselves and moving down those steps, but there's moving down within each step. And that's what I want to explain to you today. And the use of why is critically important. So it's about exploring what you've just said, not justifying what you've said, not continuing what you've previously said, not explaining what you've said, and not trying to clarify what you've said. So let's look at this steps model. You can see I've got 7 steps, and the metaphor here, of course, is that I'm looking for you to transcend from the starting point. Now, the starting point, there'll always be a primary question. Let's just assume it's a question like this. To what extent do you recognize an entrepreneurial self, perhaps in your everyday life? To address that primary question, there are 7 supporting questions. And the supporting questions in order are: what have you learnt that's new about yourself relative to the primary question? How does this relate to your values? What it is that you've learnt that's new relative to the primary question? Have your beliefs and values been challenged? Where is your life experience during this process? Where is your appreciation of others? What new sources of information have you engaged with? And finally, what have you learnt about yourself as a learner during this process? Now, question 7 is actually quite distinct in that it's not focused on the primary question. It's focused on you stepping back and thinking about what your answers have been for questions 1 to 6. So let's look at the relationship of the primary question to those supporting questions. Well, first, we're asking you, what have you learned that's new about yourself when you think about this issue of your entrepreneurial self and your ability to recognize that? Then, if you've done that question well, it'll give you the starting point. So if you've gone deep enough in answering that question about what have you learned that's new, that should bring you down to a pretty obvious starting point, which enables you to go, and I can make sense of how this relates to my values. And if you've done that, that should bring you down to the starting point where you can comfortably engage with the question about, have your beliefs or values been challenged? The question about where your life experience takes you away, in a sense, from that nice stepping down the steps. I want you to think about where you've got to in the first 3 questions. And now think about a past life experience or existing current life experience you're engaged in. Quite often students will say to me something along the lines of, I'm only in my early 20s. I really haven't got any life experience. And that's just rubbish. It's not possible for you not to have life experience unless you've been asleep for the last 20 years. We all face opportunities to solve problems, to try and create new value, that process of adventuring. Think about moments in time where you've had success or failure and look to reinterpret them, okay? Or where you've been confused or disappointed, or where you've succeeded. It doesn't really matter. Find an aspect of your past life that you can now revisit and try to reinterpret when you now think about the extent to what you've learnt that's new, how that relates to your values, and the extent to which those values have now been challenged or confirmed. How would that enable you to be able to go back in time or to look at something that's currently happening in your life and reinterpret that and make sense of it in a different way? Having done that, you can now start to think about the extent to which other people's thinking has influenced yours, right? So as you're walking down this set of steps, are you able to do it 100% alone? I hope not. To the extent that you can now start to bring in your appreciation and recognition of other people's thinking and how it's influencing your thinking, that's really important in being able to make this journey work. Likewise, your ability to think about the other sources of information that you've been engaging with that have challenged your existing way of thinking about things, that have challenged the confines of what you might normally engage with in terms of that's the information I understand or can cope with. Having gone through that process, you now have the ability to step right back from all of that and start to think about your thinking. Now, this is what we call developing metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about your thinking, and it's starting to get that clarity around why you are as you are. Now, in this case, we've got a focus on, let's say, entrepreneurship, but we're also interested in you as a learner, because a big part of this process of developing a conviction and developing better perception about you and your environment is enabling you to actually have that capacity to understand exactly how it is that you're thinking. What mistakes are you making? What opportunities are you missing? Being able to shine some light on that process. So that's the journey that I want you to go on. 7 steps. The questions more often than not relate to each other, but sometimes I want you to bring something in, like your life experience, like your consideration of other people's thinking, like other new information sources which you may be dealing with for the first time. To make that journey actually all knit together and work, you need to use why. Why is a specific tool that's going to help you to reflect. It's going to help you to move down the steps in the right process. Let's look at a simple question. I don't like reflecting. You may have said that, I might have asked you, do you enjoy reflecting? That could be something. And you've answered, you've got a statement in your reflection saying, I don't like reflecting. So then the why would come after that, right? And you've got 3 choices. You can either use the why horizontally, or in a diagonal sense, or vertically. Now, I want you to use the vertical process. So a horizontal answer would be something like, because we learn more if we just focused on the theory. So it's just an opinion, right? It's a justification of why you don't like reflecting. Alternatively, you could be a little bit diagonal, because the process is difficult for me, right? So now we're getting somewhere between a feeling and an opinion. But a much better answer would be, because I've never been comfortable sharing my inner thoughts with others. Great. And of course, that would then be followed by another why. Why is it you've never been comfortable sharing your inner thoughts? And so on and so on. So a typical paragraph for each one of those steps is going to be structured like this. You give me your first sentence, you ask yourself why. You get the vertical movement happening, which produces your second sentence. You then have another why. Then you try to address that in a vertical sense with your third sentence. Whatever you've said there is then challenged again. You explore that using your why again. Your fourth sentence, on to your fifth, and most probably your sixth sentence. Now, that's not to say every paragraph's going to have 6 sentences. I'm just suggesting that would be sufficient to have done the reflection if you have used why in a vertical sense. Now, when you get feedback from me, you might find me saying something along the lines of, you used a lot of horizontal why, which means you've been justifying, you've been explaining, you've been clarifying, as opposed to exploring what you just said. Okay? So keep that in mind when the nature of the feedback that you receive. So some basic tips are, there's going to be a word limit, and the word limit should be designed to enable you to sort of have both the pursuit of the depth for that vertical, but also to be concise. All right, so we don't want this to spill into pages and pages. It's important that you just keep it concise, because that means you're really chopping away and you're able to get down these stairs in a nice manner. Good answers are typically going to use why 4 to 5 times, and the challenge is to stay vertical each time. So you might go vertical once, but then your third sentence is totally horizontal, or maybe the next one's diagonal. So you sort of lose your way a little bit, all right? And the most important thing is to remember that the reflection is all about you. There's no right answer. You don't have to think, what does the educator want me to say? In this case, all you need to do is follow the process. Trust the process. I've got to get down these steps, and I've got to get down the steps using why vertically, not horizontally, and preferably not diagonally. So, this is what we would be doing. We've still got, we're assuming the same primary questions are sitting up the top. That's what we're always trying to keep a focus on, the primary question. We don't want to answer our questions on the steps in relation to something else, right? We need to keep that focus and keep it tied to the primary question. So when we're asking ourselves, what have you learned that's new relative to the primary question, we want to have that why enabling us to get down into that starting point for the next step, all right? So we want to explore your thoughts vertically to move down the steps, all right? And if you've done that well, if you've done question 1 exactly how you should have, then you'll be ready to start the next question, which says, how does this relate to your values? Because by getting vertical movement into that first question, you'll have already got down to some underlying reason about why it is that you've recognized something that's new about you. And everything will just work perfectly. And then you repeat that process again for number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then, of course, you step back and ask yourself, what does this tell me about myself in terms of me and my ability to be a better learner? Okay? What I don't want to see you doing is doing this, okay, where you avoid, I want you to avoid justifying, clarifying, and or explaining your thoughts by just going horizontally, all right? So you can see the problem here is that in addressing question 1, you've headed off in such a direction that you're nowhere near the starting point for question 2, all right? Because without that vertical movement, you've just sort of left yourself up hanging in this other point above question 2, and now question 2 doesn't have a starting point. And that's the whole nature of how why is going to connect up and work with the actual process of coming down these steps. It's what enables you to move from one step to the next step. As you're going down these steps, keep in mind that someone's going to be assessing that process of you getting, hopefully, that vertical movement down the steps. And there's actually going to be assessment of each individual step. So don't skip steps, don't jump steps by thinking, well, I've done really well on that one, I'm running out of words, therefore, because you're just going to lose grades that you could have had by having an even and consistent attempt at all of the steps. More often than not, the final question, your consideration of your approach to learning and strategies for improvement, that step is going to be the one that has the highest weighting of marks, because that's what we're really looking for you to actually be able to achieve, that metacognition. It's the final outcome of that process of reflecting. So keep in mind that you understand how your movement down the steps is going to be connected to the process of assessing your work. And the two factors which are the most important are the vertical depth that you achieve and your ability to develop that clarity by being concise. So staying within the word limit. Now, in closing, it's very important that you realise that a lot of times we talk about the two brains that we have. The big brain in our head and the little brain in our heart. And it's quite interesting to know that the brain sends less information, less signals to our heart than our heart sends to our brain. Our heart is a really, really important part of the jigsaw puzzle of what actually keeps us alive and ticking and making sense of the world. In this particular case, this is not an exercise for you just to rely on what's in your head. To get that vertical movement, you've got to become vulnerable to the process, and you've got to be able to tap in and listen and understand what's in your heart. It's a combination of using both brains. The big brain, which we always rely on, and the little brain, which we quite often ignore. To the extent that you can find a balance between both of these, you will do just fine.